Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this session. We have two talks for this session. The first one will be by Professor Arjun Ramakrishnan. So Arjun is a cognitive scientist. He did his PhD from the National Brain Research Institute Center in India and then moved to Duke University for a postdoc and then the University of Pennsylvania. And from there, he joined IIT Kanpur as a faculty, where he's currently in the Department of Cognitive Sciences.
Yeah, so, biological sciences as well as cognitive sciences.
So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Really happy to be here. Thanks so much to the organizers to invite me, because I am, if at all, somewhat tangentially related to the ongoings of the workshop. In fact, as I was introduced, I am actually a neuroscientist looking into cognitive neuroscience and trying to understand how we learn and make decisions in different contexts, and to understand that in both humans and non-human primates. So essentially, we are setting up a lab where we can get animals like monkeys to play video games so that we can record from the brain and understand how and what and how is going on. So this is a somewhat new line of work that's taken off in the lab in the recent years, thanks to a master's student who was really interested in understanding social dynamics in a certain situation. And therefore also this is a somewhat new line that I've never presented before, maybe there are some gaps here and there. So it'll be really nice to know how it flows and if there's any feedback from you at the end of it all. With that, I'll get started. So I'll begin with a slide on social learning. We all learn from each other, and this seems to be something that we do very naturally. By this, I mean that we look at the other person and sometimes do what they do and do it for the reason that they're doing because it's important for us. And as contrasted with, for example, you could put in the time and energy to do something and learn something on your own accord. But sometimes that is going to take you a lot of time, and it is a lot easier to pick up something by watching what the other person is doing, and may not make all the sense to reinvent the wheel completely. So there's always this dilemma in a given situation, depending on the situation and the context. For example, if you're at an examination hall, watching what the other person is doing might not be the right thing to do. Whereas if you're in another situation, like let's say a new place, a new workshop, you're watching your friends go about to different places, eat, maybe that's the right place to go, because you want to belong to the group and figure out what is the right thing to do. So of course, the advantages being that this sort of learning, as opposed to how you learn across evolution, can be very, very quick. And it need not need dedicated intelligence, in the sense you could have some kind of a common computational process that allows you to learn what the other person is doing very quickly. And this somehow allows us, or at least this is the hypothesis, that it allows us for the collective smarts over individual smarts. And maybe we are therefore able to do a lot more in an individual's lifetime, as opposed to if it were not there. I mean, of course, it's a very binary distinction at this point, but you will be able to do a lot more by learning from the others around you, which would take you much longer to do otherwise. So, of course, this brings us to a set of experiments that were done in the 50s, where for the first time, and as I said, there's always this confusion of whether you want to mimic what the other person is doing or do whatever you think is the right thing to do. An interesting set of experiments in the 50s for the first time. Solomon Asch, he was a Gestalt psychologist, and he was very interested in understanding people, especially and their social acts in their settings, right? The experiment is actually simple, but also incredible in some sense. So match to sample. All he said to these participants was to look at the sample and match that with one of the three options that were given here. And in addition to themselves doing the task, there were trials in which, for example, they would get the answers from Confederate observers. So these are other people who are watching the same task and doing the same task and giving answers out. In this case, they're saying, in this particular trial, they're saying it's 2, 2, 2, 2. All of these guys are saying 2. And therefore, the participant who's of interest to us is, in some situations, actually going with 2, even though clearly you can make out that it's probably 3. So this made a splash at that time in the 50s, because even though this was not universal, it was not happening in all participants, there were a fraction of participants who were completely being influenced by the confederates, even though they knew what the correct answer was. So for example, before the experiment, although most of them said that they won't conform, some thought that the group must be right? Because that's why you're conforming to what is going on. And even though they knew the answer, they would have gone along, I mean, they would have gone along anyway, because that's something that they wanted to do, sort of belong to the group. So either they knew the answer but wanted to go along anyway, or they thought that maybe the right answer was what the group was giving them. So this is what he used to define these two terms here. So normative conformity being you knew the answer but you went along with the group anyway, like you wanted to belong to the group despite knowing that was wrong. And in this case, it's informational conformity because you thought you would get more by being part of the group. Although this is again like a very binary distinction, you could be doing both of these to some extent in different contexts. And so there have been like, okay, so sorry, going back, even though, yeah, so this is again the whole experiment in itself, like very few errors that they made when they were performing this by themselves, but quite a few of them actually went wrong when the other people were giving them wrong answers. So anyway, so that's that. So why conform? Of course, this gives you access to group resources, and it helps you protect, gives you protection from social rejection and things like that. And it also perpetuates some sort of charitable behavior among group mates. But of course, it also ends up in such a way that you could be undermining the crowd wisdom, in the sense that if, let's say, all of us are copying what the other person is doing, if you have like a whole bunch of people who are imitating, then of course you could converge onto the wrong answer, and then all of us are giving out the wrong answer, right? So that is how you might end up having this. But of course, if you go the other way, that is you do everything on your own, in easy situations, it does not seem like it purchases you a lot, but in harder conditions, you would actually be spending a lot of time learning things. So of course, there have been subsequent experiments where people have observed that your tendency to flip either way depends on the kind of information or the kind of settings that you're in. So if, let's say, the reward or the rewards at stake are increased, or if the expertise of the individuals who are giving you advice is going up or going down, you tend to flip between different strategies in these conditions. So for example, here, just to highlight, I won't tell you what this game is. Imagine this as selecting the right option in some sense. And you have some information at your disposal, that is, there is a cost versus there is a gain if you get the answer right, versus you have majority expertise versus minority expertise at your disposal. How do you take that advice in these different conditions? And you can clearly see that you go towards, all of these increase as you go towards high stakes conditions. But the difference between, that is, so this is like the high expertise versus the low expertise, the difference between them is kind of reducing with higher rewards. But you go with high stakes, high expertise, even when there is a lot of uncertainty and the costs are high, right? So it looks like we have these different strategies that we could flip back and forth. And in fact, there was an opinion piece that came out in 2015 that sort of used a neurocomputational model, essentially trying to take the idea of dual signal processing, in the sense, let's say you're hearing a sound, you're also seeing something, and both of these sources of information are being combined in an optimal sense to give you the location of an object, right? Like that's very intuitive for us. Likewise, it could just be the case that you have a social stream, you have an individual stream, and you're able to combine these two streams in a somewhat optimal sense to tell you what the right thing to do is. So in a sense, if you could take advantage of existing neurocomputational models that allow you to combine streams of information optimally, you may be able to explain these different types of conformity from a Bayesian optimal perspective as well. So these were the things that were in the background when we started thinking of what should we do, like what are the gaps, like why are we interested in this? So the first thing for us that was of interest was that most of these tasks were very reduced laboratory-based tasks. So we wanted to engage participants in something that is a little more naturalistic. For example, a patch foraging task where they have to forage for resources. and especially naturalistic from the point of view that, and we've done this before previously in the lab, and people have studied animals and humans in the wild. They seem to have a sense of what is rational, what is how to maximize the rewards given the costs that are associated with it. So naturally, you have some kind of expertise in these conditions that we wanted to tap into, and therefore use this sort of a task, but then ask the question, if you know what you're doing, would you still display these different strategies? If you do, then what sort of flexibility do you display in these different social contexts? Let's say if you're competing for resources versus when you are just foraging alongside a bunch of others. And lastly, we wanted to understand if we could take advantage of existing computational models that are based on the neural architectures to see how we could explain the sort of decisions that are happening in these conditions. So if you are going along with the group versus you're very vigilant and watching out and doing the right things, how does that change, and can the same model account for all of this? So before that, a little bit of an introduction to what happens in a task like patch foraging. So essentially reward-based learning, which enables us to forage for food. A large number of animals, I mean all of us, animals and humans, do this. In fact, it's hypothesized that the primate brain size increased based on foraging complexity, going from lemurs to humans. And we've reduced this to a lab-based version, which is a virtual foraging task. Essentially, you have to collect berries. Depending on how many berries you get at the end of the session, you get rewarded, you're compensated based on that. You could get all the berries here, or at some point decide that that it's not worth staying here, and you could move on to the next patch or the bunch over there. Of course, the whole trade-off is between getting berries here versus getting poorer quality berries here versus spending a while going there, not getting anything, but then having access to better resources at that point. So that's really the trade-off. And so this turns out to be a balance between reward and travel costs in this sense, in this version of the game. And what we've seen has been proposed in the mathematical model by Chanov in 70s is that the resources deplete over time, and therefore, given the distance to the other patch, you could decide exactly when you should leave a current bunch, right? And this is a mathematically worked out, mathematical model that tells you that this is the right time to leave. And it seems more or less on average, you do see this in humans and animals. And in fact, we see this even in the virtual versions of the task. So this is data from a large number of human participants, about 161. And you can see the dashed line here is the time that is prescribed by the marginal value theorem. And you see that on average, across these 160 individuals, on average, you seem to be converging on the right solution. But of course, you do see people leaving later, leaving earlier, consistently. And that is another line of work that's going on in the lab. I'll not talk about it right now. And you also see this in monkeys. So these are two monkeys playing a very similar version of the game across 55 sessions. And as the travel cost goes up, so this is a slightly more complicated graph where the distance to the next bunch or the next patch increases. And in those conditions, it is better for you to put more time into the patch that you're in, right? If the next cafe is like farther away, you might put up with the quality in the current cafe for a bit longer. And you can see this slowly go up. That is, your time spent in the patch goes up as the travel time goes up. So essentially, all this goes on to say that that we are like optimal foragers in these conditions, even in this reduced virtual version of the game, across several individuals and across monkeys, for example. So that brings us to the main study, right? Like, so we began by saying if people are like good at these behaviors without a lot of instructions, then one might be compelled to argue that there will be, if at all, informational conformity, because you know what to do. You are not going to be swayed away by what the other person is doing, because at least so far as what we've observed, it seems like humans are quite optimal in these conditions. So this is a study done by Chetan, who was a master's student in the lab. Currently, he's converted into a PhD student, and this is part of his master's work. A complicated design, but I'll just take you through this very quickly. Essentially, you go to mine for diamonds along with 5 others, right? So these are the 5 people represented by different colors. And you go to mine diamonds in these different spots. I mean, each one takes a spot. and 5 harvests gives you a little bit of, some money worth of diamond, but it goes down over a period of time. So every 5 harvests won't give you the same amount, it kind of decays over time. At some point, everybody decides that it's not worth it, and then they jump into the wagon and go off to the next site. Right? Traveling to the next site takes about 10 clicks. So 5 clicks to mine diamonds once. You could continue doing that till you get your money's worth in each of those patches. But if you don't, if you think you might as well save your harvesting for another patch, then you could always come back, because the overall budget of clicks is limited to 750. I mean, these are arbitrary numbers which were set based on certain criteria. But essentially, if you want to conserve how many clicks you can do or how many harvests you can do, you might as well come back and wait for the others to come back and then continue on. So time is not the issue here. Here it's the issue of holding on to as many clicks to get as many diamonds at the end of the patch. So this is a movie version of it. I won't. Okay, you can watch it. So this goes this way, and then people start harvesting, and then the number reduces over time. So this is a very highly reduced version of an actual real scenario, but sort of takes into account different things. So as soon as all the 5 come back, these will all turn green, and then they move to another location. So of course, as I mentioned, time does not matter as much, because overall time is fixed for all participants, but how much they are able to get or save their clicks for later where it's worth is really what matters. So we have data from about 96 participants playing different versions of the game, and I'll talk about that. There was a solo version where just one participant played, and a group version where you had 5 others, which is the one that I showed you. In the group version, these agents could either be under harvesting or over harvesting. That is, if let's say 10 harvests is the right thing to do, which we know based on the environment we've created, they could either be just harvesting about 3 or 4 times each time in some random but consistent way, and therefore you are paired with under harvesting agents, right? You could also be paired with over harvesting agents or optimal agents. We also had a version where it was completely driven by some kind of a competition, in the sense that the leader, that is whoever is leading at that point in terms of the rewards accumulated, gets 80% of the spoils, whereas it kind of goes down the pecking order based on your order in the group. Okay, so here's the first question. Are individuals optimal in the new foraging game? Of course, this is a new game, so we have to still test whether everything holds. And then most importantly, do they succumb to what other people are doing in these conditions? So here's what you'll see, a complicated set of graphs, but it's easy for you to spot here that on average, when you're playing by yourself, you're about 0. So 0 here is the optimal number of harvests, so it is reset to 0. Whereas when you're paired with over harvesting agents, you tend to sort of stay for longer. That is, you do more harvests because these over harvesting agents are actually harvesting more than required in these conditions. And when you're paired with under harvesting agents, you end up coming back, harvesting fewer times, which also seems to be very interesting. So very clearly they're getting swayed, even though they're really good at these conditions, in these games, and they displayed near optimal behaviors while doing this solo, they end up following what the other agents are doing. So even patch foraging in these conditions is not completely exempt from this sort of copying, right? And you can clearly see that because they're not optimal, they're not reaping the rewards that they were in the solo group. So of course they're getting fewer rewards now because they are either picking fewer berries or they are staying for too long in the patch. But of course, unbeknownst to them, they are still following a certain stereotypical patterns that are, patterns in behavior. What is that? Yeah. Yeah. No. So these are this was done solo. The group size is always the same. This was done with over harvesting and under harvesting agents. That is the only difference. The group size is the same. Okay, so we wanted to really understand what was going on underneath. So we took advantage of what are called drift diffusion models. So these are common in the decision-making literature. But if you don't understand, this is actually very, very simple to explain. So essentially, it says that you have 2 options at every time point, right? You want to stay or you want to leave the particular patch. And you could think that you are in the middle somewhere because you don't know which side to go. For the sake of explaining what this model is, right? And then you decide to stay. So, and it takes a certain amount of time, which is represented by this process going up to that surface, right? So if you are very convinced that you want to stay, then you would make that decision quickly. If you are slightly less convinced, you would take a little longer to make this decision. So essentially, you could use a very abstract model like this to model the time it takes to make this decision and the decision itself. And this baseline that they're starting from is a representation of the average reward available in the environment, which changes based on how far the patches are or how close the patches are. And when you do this, what you notice immediately is that in the group block, they are highly motivated. So essentially, these lines are much steeper. That is, they are more convinced when they want to stay, they're more convinced when they want to leave. So either way, those accumulation rates, which I'm indexing here as motivation, or the drift rate, or aka motivation, to forage is higher in this group block. So you can see this as being much higher. And then this rate decreases as a function of different agents leaving a particular patch. So that is, you see two things. One is you're motivated when there are other people foraging, and then you also tend to be losing out on that motivation when agents leave the patch. So consistently reduces as the other agents leave the patch. So it clearly tells us that at the level of the process, in terms of the time it takes, in terms of the decision they make, they are definitely influenced by the other agents, and it seems to be affecting how motivated they are to stay in a particular patch. Okay, so that was the first example, that they are getting modified, influenced by the other agents, and that is leading to these changes in motivation for them to stay versus leave a particular patch. Now that that's seen, how do we show, do they also show flexibility if we, let's say, change the context? Let's say now we turn this into a competitive game. Does that affect how they compete for resources, and how does that change all of these processes that we've talked about? So here's what happens. This is an elaborate version of the same graph that you saw earlier. So initially we saw solo over harvesting and under harvesting. We also had near optimal agents. So that is, these other agents are just performing optimally as well on average. And then you can see that subjects also converge close to the optimal, which is fine. But now when you have competing agents, so this last one is the competitive condition. Here, of course, they are also converging around the optimal number of harvests. So it seems like, because these agents were also running for rewards and kind of optimal, like in this setting, so these were kind of controlled for each other in terms of how the agents were behaving, except of course, they were incentivized in different ways in the competitive condition. You could see them performing near optimally in both these conditions. But if you look at the process underneath, you could very clearly see, again, using the drift diffusion model idea, that the competitive block was, of course, the most motivating for them. And they were also highly motivated only until the first agent left. So the moment the first agent did something, they realized there was something going on. Maybe they should be changing their decision as well. Or there was a huge change in motivation the moment the first agent left the patch. So essentially, this brings us to the point where, like, things change when you induce competition, and then it seems to be directly impacting the motivation for them to stay in a particular patch. Okay, so now where does that leave us? This is the last part of the talk, where we really wanted to understand this from the neurocomputational basis in terms of understanding what is leading to this sort of learning in these different conditions. So that is, you make these decisions, but what are you learning? What are you taking in? How is that leading to this decision? So for this, we actually used a hierarchical Gaussian filter, which is essentially a bunch of coupled Gaussian random walks. So, so if I were to explain this at 3 different levels, you would see that the lowest level here is in fact just the observation. So these are your zeros and ones. That is, you stay, it is maybe stay is 1 and 0 is leave, but it's written the other way. But zeros and ones are stays and leaves. So these are the observations that you're making in the specific condition. This is softmax transformed version of the belief that you hold in the level x2. So essentially, you have certain beliefs which you're transforming into the final outputs or the choices that you're making, right? But if you look closely at this equation here, it is essentially a Gaussian random walk in the sense that it takes the previous value of the process as the mean, but the standard deviation or is based on another coupled oscillator here, or a coupled random walk here, as well as a volatility term here, right? So this tonic volatility term, omega 2, in this case it's W2, but it's actually omega 2, is, if that's high, so that is if this, so for the moment assume that k is 0, so this term doesn't exist, it's not coupled with this. You only have omega 2. So if omega 2 is high, that means that the drift rate can be higher, right? Like it can actually lead to higher learning at this level. So that is omega 2 is high, then tonic volatility is high, and then the learning rate can be high. Whereas now if you bring K into the equation, so let's say K is 1 for the sake of just discussion, then this completely couples what's happening at this level into this level. So that means that if K is high, then the learning rate, so the learning rate in this case is this, in some sense, can be flexibly adjusted based on X3. Right? That's really what this model is allowing you to do. So it is, if K is 0, then it just holds on to some level of learning, right, learning rate, and it doesn't change with time. But if K is greater than 0, close to 1, or if it's 1, then it completely couples this random walk into this, which means that now you can have a flexible learning rate based on what is happening at this level. So here's what we saw. Oops, we ran out of time. Okay, we are about to finish anyway. So, so here's what you see. So this omega term is the first thing that I'm going to talk about. And you see here that as you go from the group stage, so ignore the solo in between. So if you go from the group to the competitive condition, you see that there is a steep decrease, there's a significant decrease in how omega 2 goes down. So that is, you see that this omega 2 is going down when you go to the group level. And this reduction seems to be directly coupled with the rewards that they're getting in those conditions. So that is, you take into account a slightly higher learning rate to account for what is happening based on the other agents, and using that to increase your reward. So group foraging seems to increase your tonic learning rate, but it's not something that's changing continuously over time. It's something that you've set for the block, and that seems to be good enough to model what these participants are doing. Whereas in the competition condition, you have increased flexibility, which means that the phasic learning, which is your K, is actually highly increasing, going from the orange, which is the group, to the green, which is the competitive condition. And that seems to buy you higher rewards in the competitive condition. So essentially, by coupling in this higher level volatility term, you are able to take advantage of flexible changes that you want to make based on when the other agents are leaving, which seems to be the way to get more rewards in these conditions. And those who did that actually did better. So one last thing, which I'll go through very quickly, but we also made a more sophisticated version of these models where you had an individual stream and a social stream. Both of these were these 3-level models that I just described, and ended up coupling them with an arbitrator that tells us how much importance you have to give the social stream, right? This is a very short version of what this model is all about. But you can see that this arbitrator is also directly correlated with the rewards that you get at this level. And in fact, this turned out to be the best model of the lot, which means to say that you are paying attention to what the other participants are doing, flexibly adjusting your learning rate, and paying more attention to these other agents in these competitive conditions, right? I mean, this is all very relative, but the same participants who were behaving differently in a group are now able to do this in these conditions. So, so I put this as one of the last slides because I just wanted to say that you have a way of adjusting your learning rates, but you also have a way of modulating that learning rates over time. And we have a somewhat well understood system in play in the brain that allows you to do these things in this flexible way. But what's interesting for us is that maybe even flexibly adjusting or changing strategies in a social situation seems to be impinging on these circuits. So in summary, like you demonstrate normative conformity even in patch foraging. Individuals were able to flexibly adjust their learning rates, and we could use like a 3-level HGF to capture these changes in these different conditions. And I wanted to thank the grant agencies and take questions.
Quick question. So these experiments that you perform in the lab, these are computer experiments? Are these computer experiments? I mean, how are the
So these are real participants.
Yeah.
So they come to the lab and then they play this game on the computer.
So do you think the situation might change, the outcomes would change if they go to the real world and do these?
For sure. I mean, I think that these are very reduced versions of real world situations. So in some sense, it allows you to have fewer parameters that you have to bother with. Of course, real-world experiments are going to be more complex than these conditions. But once we understand what is happening, for us, the next step is going to be to tap on this neural circuit and see how we can either modulate or examine better what is happening. So for us, this makes more sense because now they're in the lab, they're seated at a computer, not moving around, and you can use tools to measure their brain activity. But of course, that reduces complexity and could be precluding us from looking at certain other interesting interactions and behaviors. But that said, I think whatever you understand from this model might still apply in other conditions. That's the hope, really.
Okay, so